Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book fans from all over the world. Welcome back to another thrill-packed, informative, and, mildly amusing episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me questions about what it is that I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Took a 2-week hiatus for the holidays, but mostly because I got COVID for Christmas. Yeah, I came down with the Wuhan Red Death, and I'm just getting over it. So if I cough up a lung or pass out during this broadcast, you'll know what's up. But I couldn't stay away because people were saying, "Hey, what's going on?" I woke up Christmas Day and there was no episode. I'm sure you had better things to do. Anyway, I got no cough button, so you're gonna have to put up with this. Let's start with Kian Kurji. I'm halfway through the first Doc Savage story, The Man of Bronze. I see a lot of influence it's had on the superhero genre. However, I hate to say this, but it's really dumb, isn't it? I never got into Doc Savage when I was a young man. Doc Savage paperbacks were everywhere. If you went to the barber shop, or I remember when I was a little kid, the first time I saw Doc Savage paperbacks, oddly enough, was at my mom's hairdresser's. She took me along because I was a little kid, couldn't be left alone, to the hairdresser to get her hair done. There were stacks of these Doc Savage paperbacks. I was only like 5 or 6 years old, so I thought the covers were cool, but I wasn't about to read one. And I asked about them, and the woman that owned the salon said that her son was really into them. But in later years, during the pulp revival of the mid to late 60s, when these things were readily available, this and many, many other pulp characters were readily available in paperback editions, reprints from the 30s. I tried to read a couple of Doc Savages, and I found them kind of boring. They are formulaic to a degree. Very few fictional characters are formulaic. Lester Dent, or I don't know if that's a pseudonym or that was his real name. Anyway, the guy who created Doc Savage came up with not just a formula, but a template for his stories, so that the plot progression was exactly the same in every novel, except I'm told there's one novel that doesn't follow that. Doc Savage readers must have been shocked when they were told a different story. And he would use this template and then plug in, whatever weird menace or bad guy or monster that he wanted in that story. But generally, the stories rolled down the same tracks every single time. Now, you can't argue with the guy's success. Apparently, there were readers that kind of like that. Maybe it was like a literary comfort food for them, that they didn't have to fret over the story because they always knew how it was going to turn out. They could anticipate events. They didn't want to be challenged in any way. I imagine most of the readers of Doc Savage were younger. And the series is highly influential on the superhero genre, of course. So many of the elements, he had a cool hideout, his ensemble cast of characters, the crazy, macabre, and ridiculous situations that he would get himself involved in, science fiction elements. Just Doc himself is very much a superhero, without the cape and mask. But yeah, I never got into it. I read other stuff. I mean, I like The Shadow, and I got real deep into Edgar Rice Burroughs and Conan and stuff like that. And I never read another Doc Savage. Joshua Ignatowski, do you have a favorite game show, either recent or from some point in the past? Jeopardy. That's the easiest answer. I used to watch it regularly. I don't anymore. I remember for a while when I was a security guard. I was a security guard on the evening shift, second shift, and we would arrange our dinner break around Jeopardy. So we would all be in the control room, listening to Jeopardy on the radio, because you could do Jeopardy on the radio. You didn't. Questions are read aloud. The answers are read aloud. So and we would see who won, who was the smartest guy in the room that day. But yeah, Jeopardy, is popular for a lot of reasons. And I was a regular viewer for quite a while. Twin spin for Joshua. He's used to that by now. As a logistics guy, which Christmas movies storylines do you think handles the logistics of Santa Claus in the most interesting way? The Tim Allen Santa Claus movies are the only ones that try to really, for my money, get into the logistics of it. Maybe this has something to do with Tim Allen, being a kind of a hands-on guy, being a guy interested in logistics, being interested in how things work and how things are done. Maybe it was his influence on this. I could see him in the rehearsals asking questions. Well, what about this? What about that? And most of the Santa Claus movies just take off on the fantasy element, and that's it. I thought this one at least tried to work out a consistent science, even though it's obviously magic, not science, but tried to work out, you know, how the Jolly Fat Man visits every child's home in a 12-hour period. I guess a 24-hour period, because it's going to be night. Anyway, I'm thinking too hard about this, as I always do. But the others just use the Santa Claus thing as a springboard for stories. I thought this movie tried to explore the complications and all the rest of it in an interesting way. Joshua gets a triple spin. He's been here before. In addition to the one you mentioned previously that John Romita Sr. worked on, what are your favorite Captain America stories and why? The fourth Sleeper, the Sleeper stories back from the 60s. What a terrific Cap arc this was, and why. This is the one I always think of when the geniuses in the Marvel Cinematic Universe say, well, we've done all the good Marvel stories. Well, no, you haven't. You haven't even scratched the surface. And this is the one that always comes to mind first, this and the search for Galactus in Thor. If you've never read it, it's just a hell of a Captain America story. And the basic premise is that the Nazis, knowing they were going to lose the war, but being a bunch of big, crybaby spoil sports, they buried these, horrific, horrible, mechanized war machines in various places around the globe that were timed to awaken. Thus, they were called the Sleepers. They were designed to awaken in the decades following the fall of the Third Reich to plague mankind once again with the Nazi menace. And of course, it was up to Captain America to put these things down. And each sleeper was more fearsome than the last. And I just thought that's a hell of a storyline, and it would have made a great Cap movie because it's perfect. It harkens back to his days as a war fighter in World War II. It harkens back to his past and the fact that he is a man of the past, and here he is, the only one in present day in what would be his far-flung future. He's the only one who has the key to bringing these things down. I mean, it's just a great story. And there's been other Cap arcs I like, but this is the one that always comes to mind first. Dan Perrin. Have you and Sir Nolan, he's been knighted? I missed that. Have you and Sir Nolan ever worked on a Conan story? Which of Howard's tales would be your choice to work on with him? For me, I'd love to see you guys adapt Queen of the Black Coast. It's my favorite. No, Graham and I have never done that. And I told Graham about this question and asked him if he had any images of Conan I could use in this video. And being Graham, he said, no, I don't, and didn't offer to make me one. So, but I agree with you. Queen of the Black Coast would be a hell of a story. If I were to work on Conan with Graham Nolan, I would want it to be one of the more swashbuckling ho-de-ho adventure stories as opposed to one of the darker Lovecraftian stories, clashing swords and bow waves and pirates and all the rest of it. That's what I would want to, that's the Conan I see Graham being more attracted to. I think he would be more interested in doing something like that. But it'd be cool. It'd be cool. I'm just sorry back in the day on Savage Sword. I mean, it did have some sway. It did have some juice that I didn't bring Graham on for maybe one of those anthology type stories that I was doing on Conan, because he was a busy guy too, and I don't think he had time in his schedule. He was really trying to make a career start at DC, and he didn't have time to take off for a 50-page Conan story, but might have been able to squeeze him into one of those ones that Gary and I did where we broke it up a little. Gary doing a framing device and other guest artists doing the individual chapters in between. Anyway, once again, I'm getting too deep into the weeds here. Next question. Kian Kurji, you should have gotten a twin spin because you asked the question earlier. Anyway, I owe you one. I dislike a lot of people who collect comics for investment rather than for the pleasure of reading them. That being said, you lived through a time where there were many comics that, if collected and preserved, would give out investment. So my question is, what would you say are some of the most expensive comics you sold, if any, and conversely, the most expensive you ever bought? I understand the collectability and there's a scarcity to a lot of comic books, and I don't know what the valuation of these comics is based on, because it's not always based on scarcity. I think it's like the stock market. There's a mood, and a title will rise in value. And I mean, I don't really follow it all that much because I've never been a comic book speculator. I've never been into buying a comic strictly for the investment. Silly me, I always bought them to read them. But I understand. But what I don't understand is collecting them and not reading them. And I've watched a few video shows on guys who speculate in comics and talk about the grading and all the rest of that. And you'll have these shows where it's two guys going back and forth over a box of comics they bought. And there's lots of these shows. They bought a box of comics at a garage sale and they're going through it and talking about it. And what strikes me is they know everything about the valuation and grading and all the rest of it, and they don't know anything about the comics themselves. But they speak with great authority about the characters and situations and creators and everything else, but they're almost always wrong, or they didn't get it quite right, or you can tell that their information is entirely secondhand and they really didn't understand what they were told. So it's very odd to me because, why would you be interested in comics if you weren't interested in the content? Why would you be simply interested in comics the way that someone who collects beer cans might be interested in beer? You're not really interested in the content of the magazine. You're just concerned about, is the corner chipped, or has it been folded, or is there still some sheen to the cover? I've never understood this. I never will understand this. I just want to read them. Now, as far as that goes, the most expensive comic I ever bought as a fan was Frontline Combat #1. And I was really, really into the EC war titles at the time. And you could buy them at conventions, depending upon condition, $7, $8, $12. You could buy Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales, and they were in decent condition. They weren't falling apart. They didn't stink like somebody's attic, and it was all good. And I was able to flesh out my collection, except for this one, Frontline Combat #1, and the only copy I'd ever seen was at a comic book shop in Philadelphia. And I knew the owners, because I was going in there all the time, practically lived at that place. And I kept trying to get them to reduce the price because it was $90. And $90 was basically, for me back then, like over a week's pay. So, that was well over a week's take home for me. And so it kept hanging there on the wall, and I would go in and look at it, and oh man, I'm going to come in here someday and that's going to be gone, and I missed my chance. And at the same time, it was there for months, and I was still looking for another copy. No one had a copy. This was truly a scarce comic, and that thus the $90 price tag. And so finally, I got around to talking to one of the store owners, and they were going to put an ad in a local weekly newspaper. Every town back in the early '70s had their hippie newspaper, and they were going to put an ad in there. And I said, well, I can draw that for you. I can draw it. And I drew an ad for them that they've used over and over and over again. Some people have shown it to me. It's in con booklets from the period. And so I drew the ad, and they said, well, what do you want for it? And I said, I want that Frontline Combat. So the one owner was like, well, I'll reduce the price by 50%. And then the other guy said, give the guy a break. Just give him the comic book. So I traded $90 worth of work for this comic, Frontline Combat comic. And that's the most I've ever paid for a comic. And then years later, when they reprinted them, I gave away all of my EC War comics to artist Ricardo Villagran because we were good friends, and he had done me a lot of favors, and he was a huge fan of the EC War comics from when he lived in Argentina, and he couldn't even read them; they were in English. But and we would talk about them all the time. He's just a huge fan of them, and he hadn't seen them since he was a child. And I gave him this stack of EC War comics, complete run of Frontline, complete run of Two-Fisted Tales. And he cried. He broke down crying. It was very touching. But Ricardo, if you're listening, I love you, man. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I've never been one to, no, Graham, speaking of Graham Nolan, big Golden Age collector. He's spent, quite a wad on these comics, but he wants them for the historic value, not their speculative value. And he wants to read them. He wants to, I can understand that. You spend a couple of $100, or more on like an old Golden Age Batman, and opening it up kind of takes you back to that day. You know what I mean? In a way that looking at a reprint doesn't. Although I'm all for the reprints, baby. I just want to read them. David Jordan. I've been reading a lot of stuff that you and many others that came out through Eclipse Comics. They have to be the best comic book company in the 1980s, quality and consistency wise. The only negative I could say is that the coloring wasn't great, but I chalked that up to the times, because DC and Marvel weren't much better in that regard in the 80s. Could you tell us some of your favorite stuff out of that company that you didn't write? Yeah, I mean, Eclipse was playing around with color more so than the major companies, but sometimes it didn't work, sometimes it did. I mean, Steve Olive did beautiful stuff on Airboy, and he was playing with the limitations of the 4-color process back then. But I thought he did terrific stuff. But sometimes I understand, yeah, sometimes it failed. Like this paper was never going to represent that color correctly. These watercolor effects and stuff just were not going to go over. But hey, it was worth the experiment. Eclipse had the most diverse, and I mean diverse in the real definition of that word, the line of comics I think ever. It was based on the fact that Cat and Dean published whatever they liked, whatever caught their eye. And they had very eclectic tastes when it came to everything, and including comics. And so they published the widest variety of stuff you can possibly imagine. And one of my favorites, and one I never missed, and I really looked forward to it when it came in the comp bundles, was Reed Fleming, the world's toughest milkman. It's the craziest series. I've talked about it before, and it's basically about the world's toughest milkman. This guy is a badass. Doesn't take his job too seriously. He's a big hit with the ladies, and he never runs away from a fight. And he's a milkman. And the stories are insane. They're crazy. You never knew what to expect. And thank you, Dean Mullaney, for falling in love with this comic and bringing it to all of the rest of us. because it's just a work of mad genius that no other comic book publisher ever would have touched. And they had quite a bit of success with this comic. This comic actually sold quite well. It had a loyal fan base for both the comics and merchandise. The other, of course, Rocketeer, Dave Stevens. Rocketeer started with Pacific Comics. When they went out of business, found a home at Eclipse, and you know, Dean, became friends with Dave Stevens. Dave Stevens contributed quite a bit in the way of covers and things like that, including a cover for Airboy, a wonderful, iconic cover for Airboy. So, once again, we owe Cat and Dean a debt of gratitude for keeping this particular series running. And then another one I really liked was The Prowler. It was written by Tim Truman, drawn by J.K. Snyder III. And it was Tim and J.K. just sort of updating the old, we were talking about pulps earlier, updating the old pulp genre. This mass vigilante character called the Prowler from the 30s. And he's an old man, but he takes on this young apprentice who wants to basically get into the vigilante business. And this was Tim indulging all of his wildest pulp fantasies. And then he had ably assisted by John K. Snyder, who really brought this his own idiosyncratic style to the artwork, with the heavy blacks and expressionistic artwork. It really, really suited. This was a terrific marriage of two creators sharing the same vision and really knocking out some interesting and sometimes funny stuff. Joseph Donnelly III. Any feelings or thoughts to Archie Goodwin's via secondhand recounting of Gil Kane's allegations to swiping art and selling it on the side? Seems like there are other allegations from others I've seen, Al Milgrom, Jim Shooter. Yeah, this kind of entered into legend. And there's legends always have a basis of truth. I was kind of on the peripheries of the comic book industry, and everybody heard about this. Everybody heard this story. And apparently what had occurred was that Archie was working late nights at Marvel, because that's the kind of guy he was, and would often be the last guy out. He would literally be the guy who turned out the lights at Marvel every night, because he was diligently trying to keep his books on schedule. If you know anything about the history of Marvel, that is the history of Marvel. Everything is last minute. There's always a panic. You've heard about the Marvel bullpen, but you may not understand what the Marvel bullpen was. And what the way Marvel was set up, and every time they moved to a new building, they just had the same setup. It would be this large open area and to be in the middle of the office space. And it would be basically large cubicles filled with production people. And they were doing lettering and coloring and trade dress and paste up and everything else to, this is before the age of computers, by hand, to prepare all of these books for publication. And of course, there would be last minute changes, books that came in late. There was always a panic, always a rush. And then around the periphery of the bullpen were the offices of the editors. And the place was always a madhouse. I never went there that it didn't seem like, everybody's hair was on fire. Something was running late. Something was going on. Some big commotion. And Archie would, I guess Archie thought, I'm just going to stay till everybody's gone because this place is nuts, and try to get, a handle on this stuff. And he would, stay late. And he noticed that on the nights that he stayed late, he would discover he wasn't alone. That Gil Kane, artist Gil Kane, had shown up and was in the office. And Gil would have some excuse that he needed art paper or some other thing, or he had left something behind earlier in the day. And Archie would see him go to the elevators with his portfolio. And this happened often enough that Archie became suspicious. Now he'd known Gil a long time. They were friends, everything else. But Archie was like, I don't know. I mean, why do I keep running into him in the offices long after the business day is closed? And finally, Archie stopped him at the elevator one time and said, Gil, let me look in your portfolio. And Gil had to open the portfolio, and inside was artwork. And it was artwork by, all kinds of people. And it, all kinds of people that weren't Gil. It wasn't his artwork. And what had happened was that Gil Kane was raiding the art files and just taking stuff. Uh, Jack Kirby, not Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko had got his artwork back. A lot of people don't know that. Jack Kirby, John Buscema, all this great stuff. And Gil's taking it and he's selling it on the side. Now the story about with Gil is that he always, I mean, I heard this from other people. I mean, I'm not going to take anything away from Gil as an artist and everything else, but his judgment sometimes as a human being wasn't always the best. Um, Gil was a guy that liked the finer things in life. The finest wine, eating at the best restaurants. When he traveled, he stayed at 5-star hotels, everything else. Well, these are things that in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, comic book artists couldn't afford those things. So Gil was always strapped for cash. Every dollar that came in went out. And so he always needed money. And he wasn't making enough as a comic book artist to, make ends meet. And so I guess the temptation, there's all this gold lying around everywhere. Nobody's paying any attention to it. Nobody's, treating it with any level of security. And so, he started lifting the artwork to sell on to pay the bills. And it's very, very sad. And when Archie obviously made him return the artwork, and Gil was called on the carpet by the powers that be at Marvel and told he would never work there again. And he never did. And he was told to return as much of the artwork as he had not yet sold on. And they would not press charges, which they did not. But it's a shame. It's a besmirchment on the reputation of a great comic book artist. But it's the truth. But I'm going to tell you, he wasn't the only one. I mean, Archie caught Gil, but there's a lot of people were taking artwork, stealing artwork, inside jobs out of DC and Marvel, and I'm going to include editors. I can't name names because I can't confirm anything. But I'll tell you this, in the 1970s, as a frequent convention owner, you would see lots and lots of artwork at prices that didn't make any sense. Guys were basically, I remember seeing a original art dealer arrested at a con. I was there. I saw the NYPD came in, put this guy in handcuffs, and I wasn't terribly surprised because he had a whole table of nothing but Paul Gulacy artwork from Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu. And he had stacks of these things, and he was selling them for like $30 a piece for Paul Gulacy pages. You original art collectors out there, you've just broken out into a sweat. $30 a piece for classic, and they were like entire issues. And it's like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are these here? This book only came out like 6 months ago. So yeah, there was a lot of thievery going on. There's a lot of quote unquote missing original artwork that's vanished into people's collections. But I mean, I remember even down in Philadelphia, guys would show up at comic shops with portfolios bulging with originals. You could buy a Kirby New Gods page for $40. So there was a huge black market in that. Thankfully, things have changed with the kerfuffle over the Kirby artwork at Marvel and things like that, and policy changes at DC Comics. and the artists, pencilers and inkers, they get their artwork back. They get it returned to them. But the dirty little secret at Marvel is it's still considered an incentive. That on paper, legally, Marvel is not obligated to give you that artwork back. They give it back to you as a gift. Kind of creepy. But anyway, that's the story behind that. Yes, it was true. I mean, it was told to me by many, many reliable sources that Gil Kane had stolen a lot of artwork. People who didn't want to, they liked Gil and they were reluctant to tell these stories. It wasn't out of maliciousness. It was mostly their shared disappointment that this guy had betrayed the trust. But again, a lot of editors got away with it. And the oddest thing about the story is, and what struck me when you first asked this question, was the very last time I saw either Archie or Gil Kane alive was in the DC offices. They were both in fighting like their third bout with lymphoma, and they were sitting in an office. I just walked by and I glanced in, and they were sitting in Archie's office, just having a friendly chat. And what struck me was they'd both been through chemo and everything else, and they looked like ghosts. It was very sad because I liked both men very, very much. And I've made no secret of how much I admired Archie Goodwin. But they just, it was very, very sad because you could tell, okay, they've been fighting this for years, but they're losing the battle. And there's just they look so frail and pale. But it was kind of a bittersweet moment seeing these two old friends, perhaps meeting for the last time. So there you go. What a downer! What a downer here at Ask Chuck Dixon. But I bring you the brutal facts, unvarnished. Alex asks, hey, I have a question for you regarding the work rates at Crossgen. You've spoken before about artists doing a page a day. How was it for the writers? I'm curious to know how much further ahead you wrote if you were at the offices writing every day. If so, how much of El Cazador did we never get? Well, we were all paid every 2 weeks, and it was a salary. And it was every artist and writer negotiated their own, this is what I need to live on. This is what I generally make a year. This is my page rate. This is how many pages I do. And then they would work it out with Mark Alessi, and he would make them an offer. Like, I'm going to pay you X amount a year, and that's X amount every 2 weeks. And you get a workspace. You get, free coffee. You get full medical coverage, and the medical coverage at Crossgen was excellent. Absolutely excellent. Best outside insurance, third-party insurance I've ever had. In fact, Mark was very proud that he actually probably lengthened the life of some of the Crossgen contributors, because a lot of these guys had never had a real medical examination. And and you had to have that to get the Crossgen insurance. You had to go see a medical doctor and get a full workup. And quite a few of the artists in our stable, they uncovered serious chronic medical conditions that needed treatment. And these guys, got that treatment paid for by Crossgen. So that was all good. So it wasn't a page rate. It was a biweekly salary. And then, there were lots of other perks. All of our expenses were paid at conventions. I think once a month, and in the summers, once a week, we had an outdoor barbecue. And for the writers and the art directors and people like that, we had an expense account. We had a credit card we could use for lunches and dinners, business related. A little bit of that got abused, but not by me. Not by me. I was very stingy with my account. But how far ahead did I work? I worked way, way ahead. I would, once I got comfortable that I was well ahead of my pencilers on my various books, I would then bore in on a particular title, and I might write 4 issues of Brath in a row, 4 issues of Sigil in a row. And so by the end of like a 2 month period, I was 6 months ahead of everybody. And I remember we didn't have editors, but we had sort of trafficking business managers. We had a little bit of administration beneath Mark. And I remember one of them hassling me because I would roll into the offices whenever I wanted. I might show up at 11, you know, or 10:30. 1 in the afternoon, I might say, I'm going to go to the movies and go out and catch a matinee. And one of the business managers was like, you need to be here at 9. You need to be here at 9 to 5. And I said, well, I'm usually here from like 10:30 to 11 at night. I'm living here basically. And they said, well, no, but you need to be here on time. And I said, how many months ahead am I on my schedule? And that was the end of that argument. Because I was definitely producing for the company and staying, well ahead of any kind of deadline, any kind of schedules they had for the work. But but I gotta say, I mean, the artists were limited to a page a day. The writers, there wasn't any limit. As much as you wanted to write, you write. And I remember me and Tony Bedard in particular. I mean, we were tearing it up. We were just, pounding on that keyboard, every second of the day we were there, and keeping our pencil teams happy, and basically doing our job. So it was fun. It was fun. I still miss it. It was a great atmosphere. In fact, I'm going to go have lunch today with my buddy Sergio Cariello. So it's cool. It was a community of comic book talent. It'll never be recreated. We'll never see it again. Key and Kurji again. Man, you needed a triple spin. I owe you again. You said you didn't like the ending of Watchmen. Do you have any suggestions for a better ending? Yeah, almost any ending would have been better. I mean, Watchmen built up an expectation that it was going somewhere. I'm not that huge a fan of Watchmen. It's certainly readable. It's certainly entertaining. I don't share Alan Moore's worldview, but it is an excellent example of the craft. I mean, you cannot take that away from it. What Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons did here, with their cinematic storytelling style and pushing the envelope, pushing the outside of what the grid layout could do. I mean, working within this tight 9-panel grid format, and working wonders within that format. Yeah, it is. It is undeniably a masterpiece of comics, except the freaking ending. And my biggest problem with the ending was it wasn't a new ending. It was lifted from an episode of Outer Limits that was called The Architects of Fear. And in that episode, Robert Culp is an astronaut, and he volunteers for a program that will change his genetics to create basically and turn him into an alien creature. I mean, full-blown alien creature, nothing human or not much human about him. And he's willing to give up his humanity. And the whole premise is that if the powers that be on the planet could be convinced that we were under threat of an alien invasion, that we were not alone in the universe, that there were belligerent forces somewhere from beyond the stars threatening the existence of Earth, that it would end war. And we would all unite as a humanity against a common foe, even though it's an imaginary foe. And that was the premise of the story. Brilliant story. And it's been borrowed many, many times in science fiction. But sadly, it got borrowed in one of the most high-profile comic book series of all time, Watchmen. And it's just a lame ending. I mean, I met, and I think part of it is the series changed editors midway through the series of Watchmen. And I think that the Watchmen series had taken on so much prestige and took so much of the air out of the room at the time that the new editor was afraid to say, "Hey, Alan, your ending sucks. You got to come up with something better, than this, than stealing an idea that so many fans have been exposed to." And that's my biggest problem with it. And I'll bet if you stuck a pin in Alan Moore, he'd admit, yeah, I should have worked a little harder on that. I should have come up with something fresh to pay off all those issues. Doc Farnoff, what was your first published comic book story? It was something called Corny and Zorn, and it was for a comic magazine, regretfully called Gasm. And Gasm was published by Countrywide Publications, which was an exploitation publisher. They published Jaws of Death for years. They published UFO magazines full of phony accounts of UFO abductions. And they're real, low rent outfit, very successful, very, very profitable. And they saw the sales of Heavy Metal magazine and the success of Star Wars and decided to get into that. And they were looking for artists. I don't know how. I think it was my buddy Bob Walters, great paleontology dinosaur artist. He somehow heard about it through the Jungle Telegraph that these guys were looking for talent. And so, I hauled my portfolio up there and showed them a bunch of stuff. And they said, I pitched a few ideas. And they were like, okay, well, all right. We need 11 pages. We're 11 pages short on this first issue. And I said, well, what do you want? What do you want the story to be about? And the guy said, by next Friday. He didn't care what it was. 11 pages of comics by next Friday. So on the train back to Philly, Bob Walters had come along with me on the trip. He was showing off inking samples. He had toyed with the idea for a while of becoming a comic book inker, even though he was more of a fine illustrator. And we started bouncing ideas back and forth. And I think he's the one that said, what's popular right now? What's popular on TV? And I'm like, Starsky and Hutch show. So do Starsky and Hutch in space. And so Corny and Zorn was born. And I penciled, inked, and lettered 11 pages. And I dutifully was there the following Friday and got paid $40 a page for everything. $40 a page. $440 is the biggest check I'd ever seen in my life at that point. And I was a working comic book artist, woohoo, and writer. Boy, oh boy. And, paid the bills for a little bit. And I worked on the next couple of issues. Now, the artwork I'm showing here of Corny and Zorn is later stuff, I believe. I don't think this is from the original story. Or maybe it is. Maybe it is. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it was fun while it lasted. and then Countrywide discovered reprints. They began reprinting the same kind of material from underground comics and stuff like that. Licensing, I think they licensed some early Rich Corbin, and they were running that instead of looking for new stuff. So that was my first published work, 1978. Ace Mowick. Oni Press has recently resurrected the EC Comics brand with new comic titles. Epitaphs from the Abyss, Cruel Universe, Shiver suspense stories, and the upcoming Cruel Kingdom. Would you have any interest in working on any of these titles, assuming they are planning to hire veteran comic writer artists? And would you hope that they would start up a war and Western title as well? Also, I've read Cruel Universe. I've enjoyed it so far. But do you think this resurrection would work long term, or might just be a flash in the pan? They don't try to widen out the market beyond comic stores. Well, certainly if they don't get into the book market, into the casual reader market, which is where these comics probably would thrive right now. If they can't get out of that market, they're going to die, because the comic shops are all about superheroes and nothing but superheroes. I mean, I don't know. Maybe these are selling very well. I would hope so. I don't wish anybody failure. This is certainly a noble effort. Would I be interested in working for them? Yeah, I might. I mean, they have not reached out to me. I'm I have a busy schedule. I don't need work, so I won't be pitching to them. I won't be seeking them out to pitch story ideas. But were they to reach out for me and say, "Hey, you got any ideas?" I certainly would entertain the notion. But yeah, I mean, these kind of anthology short form horror. I mean, I love that title, "Cruel Universe." Not so sure about epitaphs from the abyss. I got to imagine a lot of young readers are like, I don't understand any of those words. I understood from and the, uh, but I just like the whole concept of cruel universe because it is a cruel universe, my friends. Very violent place out there amongst the stars. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would certainly entertain that. And now I gotta seek some of these out. I haven't been to a comic shop in a very long time. And that's not to say that these comics are even in the comic shop. You know what I mean? I mean, you know, a real heavy duty, serious comic book retailer might order 5 each of these, and they'll be gone. You know, in a nonce. So anyway, yeah, I'd work for them if they. I would think about working for them. I'd think about pitching some ideas, if they were to reach out. But like I said, I don't really need to work right now. Hey, if you want to reach me with suggestions, questions, whatever, brunobookstore@gmail.com. Bring your controversies, your hate mail, death threats, whatever, to brunobookstore@gmail.com. It's the most reliable way of reaching me. That's it for this week. Happy New Year to all. And I hope to see all of you down the road.